Apala is assistant professor of English at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. That's the problem when you have, as a co-convener, a professor of Turkish literature. We tend to hijack the conference by bringing in specialists of Turkish literature or situated or set in Turkey. Apala received a PhD in English from the University of Toronto in 2024, and she's currently working on a book project that examines the relationship between aesthetic discourse and modernist aesthetics in the global 20th century. The work has appeared or is forthcoming in numerous journals, among others the Wallace Stevens Journal, the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Modern Fiction Studies, Religion and Literature, and the Bloomsbury Philosophy Library's Aesthetics and Politics in the Global South. I think it's a handbook. Yeah. Apala is going to talk about mysticism and the modernist postsecular in Tayeb Salih.
Thank you, Professors Mignon and Al-Shahi, for organizing this conference and for having me here. And thanks to all of you for being here today. Good afternoon. And this is the part of the talk that I had not prepared. I realized through the morning, through our discussions, that I needed to position myself. And I think Timur's talk really has opened up that context for me to position myself. The synaptic gaps of translation, of interlinguality, is something that I run the risk of falling through in respect to Tayeb Salih, because again, my access to Tayeb Salih's works is entirely through their English translations. But also going back to another point that Timur mentioned, about the canonization of Tayeb Salih is underway, and I think I would like to add that he has been canonized already as a global modernist writer, and that's how. So not just through translations, through the gaps of translations, but also Tayeb Salih came to me because I was a student of modernism. I was taking a course in Canada on comparative modernism, and my professor taught Tayeb Salih's novel in English, and that's how I got introduced to the world of Tayeb Salih. So my approach to Tayeb Salih, therefore, is through the translation, through this mediation. I don't know if the gap between the English and the Arabic can really be crossed over through imagination, by my imagination. But at the same time, my approach to Tayeb Salih is also through a modernist lens. I'm a modernist literary scholar, and so that's basically my positioning. And one more thing to clarify: when I say modernism or the modern, I don't mean. Because I will be talking about religion to some extent. There are modern positions, the modernist positions within literary traditions, within religious thinking, within religious traditions, that would, for example, think of the mystical as a space of alterity, as another space. That's not the modernist position that I'm taking. I'm taking a literary position, so basically my training in critical reading and formalistic reading of modernist literature is what I'm bringing into this talk. So my topic today is mysticism. What I'm going to do here is begin with reading Salih, a couple of passages from the most mystical of his novels, The Wedding of Zion, that Amal has already introduced us and set the stage for our discussion here today, to lay out how Salih very directly talks about or treats the topic of mysticism in his work, and then I'd sort of just introduce, a very specific critical modernist lens or reading of mysticism into Salih's literary world, and therefore my ambition would be to kind of not establish Salih as a Sufi writer, for example, like he's a writer of Sufism, but to kind of establish Salih as somebody who's thinking through a modernist literary, a global modernist literary lens, and he's approaching mysticism as specifically a modernist method, and much more, and of course, a literary method, a formal method, but a modernist method. So that's his vision that I'm particularly focused on. Oh yes, the wedding of Zion centers around the incredible wedding of Zion. Nobody in the village can believe that Zion's wedding is finally happening. Zion, who burst out laughing the moment he came into this world, and has been laughing since, with only 2 teeth in his mouth. So these are the lines. He had grown up with only 2 teeth in his mouth, one in his upper jaw and one in the lower. His mother, though, says that his mouth was once filled with pearly white teeth, but that when he was 6, she took him one day to visit some relatives of hers. At sunset, passing by a deserted ruin rumored to be haunted, Zion had suddenly become nailed to the ground and had begun shivering as with a fever. Then he let out a scream. After that, he took to his bed for several days, and on recovering from his illness, it was found that all his teeth had fallen out, except for one in his upper jaw and one in the lower. And I have another quote from the opening of Zion, the wedding of Zion. Zion had an elongated face with prominent bones to his cheeks, his jaw, and under the eyes. His forehead was rounded and jutted out. His eyes were small and permanently bloodshot, their sockets deeply set in his face like 2 caverns. His face was completely hairless, with neither eyebrows nor eyelashes, and on attaining manhood, no hair had sprouted on his chin or upper lip. Now, I owe my understanding of the Sufi elements in the wedding of Zion to scholars like Kenneth Harrow, Ziad al-Marshafi, and Sophia Samatar, who have very meticulously read Sufism in elements of Sufism in Salih's works and in Wedding of Zion in particular. So these scholars would read Zion's 2 teeth as symbolizing the human and the divine realms within the context of mystical union. Zion, the holy fool, God's madman, is a liminal figure. He constantly exceeds the bounds of the human in his grotesqueness, his carnivalesque nature and activities, his extra-human strength, and his extra-social dealings. Zion displays non-human physical strength when he beats up Saifeddin, who is a foil to him, a rowdy counter character in the novel, something like the saint's alter ego. Zion is central to the village and stood tall and thin in his place at the heart of the circle of the village like a mast of a ship. As the pole of the dhikr, remembrance, it was impossible to tie him down, for he was drawn more to dwelling more on the perimeter of life in the village, in the oasis on the edge of the desert, where there was not only evening pleasure and drunken laughter, but also, quote, something frightening, something delightful, yet intimidating, that tempted one to reconnoiter, unquote. And on his wedding day, Zion was like a cock, indeed as resplendent as a peacock. They had dressed him up in a kaftan of white silk, which they had encircled with a green sash, and over it all he wore an abba of blue velvet, so full and flowing that when it was caught by the wind, it looked like a sail. On his head, he had a large turban that slanted forwards slightly. In his hands, he carried a long crocodile leather whip, and on his finger, he wore a gold ring in the shape of a snake that sparkled in the light of the sun by day and shone under the glare of the lamps by night. For in its head was set a ruby. He was intoxicated without having drunk from the great din and clamor around him. In an interview in discussing the wedding of Zion, Salih himself said that the world of this novel is a futuristic one full of love and life and perfected belonging. So in Salih's own words, the hero of the wedding of Zion, he is all heart, compassion, love, and life. The world is beautiful just as I wish it to be. It is the world of the wedding of Zion. It is the society I dream of, he says, which does not exist at the moment. Characters in the novel are, quote, characters existing on love and emotion, who try to implant themselves in the place, are harmonious and in tune with the cosmos, unquote. Now, on a side note, most of my images here are from the portfolio of Matthew Reichel, who's a Canadian-American Mexican documentary photographer. This image is of Kassala in eastern Sudan, which is a major center of Sudanese Sufism, tied mainly to the Khatmiya order. Kassala is about 600 miles east of Khartoum, and this is an image of after Friday prayers near the shrine in the evening. Zion fell in love all too often, and in the village, he became an emissary for love, quote, became an emissary for love, transporting its sweet fragrance from place to place, unquote. In the novel, Zion is finally getting married to Nima, a girl with a serious, quiet, and responsible disposition who rejected school education as a child because, in her words, quote, it's quite enough to read and write and to know the Quran and the rituals of prayer, unquote. The English word mysticism comes from the Greek root muein, meaning to close the eyes or mouth, to close, to shut, so that to keep, so as to keep hidden secret knowledge unspoken, unexposed. Mystical knowledge is therefore secret, silent, ineffable. Mystical experience exceeds ordinary perception and makes possible a direct and immediate relation with the divine. The mystic, therefore, is magical and liminal. The world of Zion preserves the mystical secret. We never know, for instance, what Zion does or says towards the end of the novel when he disappears from his own wedding and is later discovered weeping inconsolably at the resting place of his murshid, Hanin. However, what we do get from the novel and through its resonances with Salih's other works is precisely the theme and method of liminality. In the novel, the village folk and the world of the village is suspended between two religious characters. The first one, Hanin, a Sufi mystic and ascetic, revered by all in the village, who in his spiritual authority towers over the second, the Imam, the representative of official, legal, and normative Islam in the village. Although the narratorial perspective remains equidistant from all of the characters, Zain, Hanin, and the Imam, I sometimes feel while reading the novel that arguably the novel plunges its reader into the gang of the secular folk, the Majub gang. While Majub and folks like him treated the Imam as a kind of bureaucratic and necessary figure, not too different from them and flawed, they carried, quote, an innate awe of religious people, especially ascetics like Hanin, and took warning of their predictions, feelings, despite their lack of outward concern that they had mysterious powers. Therefore, the reader, like in Salih's other novels, floats in between two poles of the dialectic. In Season of Migration to the North, these poles were the narrator and Mustafa Said. In The Wedding of Zion, this magical, mystical, possibly also miraculous realm is portrayed exquisitely through a symbolic chiaroscuro of intermingling light and shade and darkness. The Majud gang, sometimes when they were plunged in laughter, the light and shadow danced above their heads as though they were immersed in a sea in which they floated and dipped. There's another quote. It is at times like this that you see them all together between light and darkness, as though they are drowning in a sea. So this is the chiaroscuro, the image of chiaroscuro recurs in the novel. Here I'd like to quote a few lines from Kenneth Harrow's 1987 essay, which remains one of the most extensive and informative readings, I think, of this liminal mystical realm in the wedding of Zion. If love and the heart are the clearest Sufi qualities linked to Zion, the light which completes this imagery is the most complex aspect of this constellation of attributes. And in its usage, sometimes something may be seen of the essence of Salih's vision. Light and dark, like the exoteric and esoteric, the moral and the mystical, the literal and the hidden, do not completely exclude each other. Light does not exhibit merely a one-sided nature, but shares with the darkness, so that the moments of greatest spirituality are to be found on the boundary between the two states. That which characterizes the magical and powerful doom tree in the first story of the volume, The Wedding of Zion, is precisely that nebulous quality, that of the isthmus. Everything beyond it is as cryptic as talismans. Like the boundary between day and night, like the fading light, which is not the dawn, but the light directly preceding the break of day. The prayer appropriate to that moment has special qualities. It is said that the sunset prayer is strange. If you don't catch it in time, it eludes you. This is the moment in which, in between the human and the divine, the moment in which Hanin works his miracle, the cusp of or liminal region outside of time, when the normal can be suspended, permitting the supernatural dialogue to take place. In addition to describing the visible miracle as occurring at this moment, Salih constructs perhaps the most touching and effective scene in Wedding, one in which he expresses his own particularly quiet, unaggressive concept of spirituality, using the same interplay of light and dark. It is a light like that used in describing the houses of the prostitutes, where beams of lamplight flickered from their doorways and windows, a romantic, light like that of the moon on the Nile, when the water turns into an enormous illuminated mirror over whose surface moves the shadows of the palms. Now, against this backdrop, I'd like to turn to a German scholar of modernist literature, Nikolaus Largier, who's worked on mysticism and modernity. In his essay, but also broadly in his work on mysticism, Largier's central argument is this: that in modernity, mystical concepts, he mainly uses examples from medieval Christian mystics, get refracted through intellectual paradigms of secularity to shape notions of quote-unquote aesthetic experience. Largier identifies Luther as the pivot of secularity and traces what he calls the invention of aesthetic experience across Kant, Heidegger, Benjamin, and other modern philosophers. Here's a few lines from Largier. Rewritten as a form of cosmopoiesis and poetic self-fashioning, under the pressure of Luther's institution of the secular and Kant's critique, medieval mystical traditions serve specific purposes in modernity. These purposes are in no way limited to nostalgia or esoteric inclinations, although these sometimes play a role as well, but they fit into a structure of the modern poetic elaboration of possibilities and possible worlds, testifying both to the power of the institution of the secular in Luther's works and its capacity to conceal its theological origin. Largier argues that mystical tropes or mysticism's radical, transformative, and transcendental potential get recoded into concepts of modernist aesthetic experience. In this regard, Largier does not usually or very frequently refer to William James, the famous chapter in the Varieties of Religious Experience on Mysticism, or Virginia Woolf, who's one of the most oft-discussed modernist writer when it comes to mysticism, especially with reference to her novel To the Lighthouse. But Largier's conception of modernist mysticism is comparable to James's brief, quote-unquote, brief durations of illuminations and revelations, quote-unquote, unplumbed by the discursive intellect, temporal and phenomenological ruptures in which our consciousness is altered and intensified, and in which, to quote Charles Taylor via Peter Berger, ordinary reality is abolished and something, quote, terrifyingly other shines through, unquote. Largier mostly writes about medieval Christian mysticism, as I mentioned, and writes with reference to modernist writers like Robert Musil and Wallace Stevens. But if we want to extend the scope of modernist mysticism to include the archives of Roman modernism, this is where I bring in Salih and writers like Salih, then those chiaroscuric and liminal spaces in Salih's works would reveal themselves as fascinating and ingenious models of mystical modernism. Of course, Sufism would have to be our reference point. How can we read? So the questions could be, the central question could be, how can we read the phenomenological ruptures we so often encounter in Salih's works as modernist mystical reworkings of fana, or the affective cognitive portals of alterity as inspired models of marifa, for example. These are Sufi concepts. Largely talks about modernist aesthetic experience by virtue of their roots in mystical tropes and in the ways and manners in which it diversely manifests in modernist texts, as being constituted by an experimental and poetic defamiliarization of the world in experience. Now, this may not be a new idea for modernist scholars of religion, but Largier's crucial contribution is the way he traces a genealogy of this idea in traditional mysticism. To defamiliarization, which is just one of the experimental phenomenological processes Largier discusses, and defamiliarization that is cognitive, affective, and linguistic, to mention just a few related categories of experience, the ordinary world or mundane reality, to quote Berger again, reveals something terrifyingly other, which more importantly shines through to reconstruct, even reveal the self. Now, even more importantly, Largier is careful not to distinguish too strictly between the cognitive, the affective, the linguistic, and so on. He uses more comprehensive terms like experience and phenomenon. Now coming to Salih, again, coming back to Salih, this blending together or blurring amongst of the distinguishable dimensions of experience is something we find wonderfully in Salih's works, as we know. Salih very carefully delineates the aesthetic in his works, always careful not to lose the aesthetic in the Largierian sense of the aesthetic experience, always careful not to lose touch with the material. Even his materialist critics, such as the scholars of the Warwick Research Collective, have attested to. For me, Salih first roots his creative world extremely in the material and then grounds the whole thing firmly in the psychic. He imagines his native village as a quote-unquote archaeological heap containing civilizational layers over layers, where the history of the Sudan, pharaonic, pagan, Christian, Muslim, is condensed. Therefore, Wat Hamid, the fictional village, carries a unity of place and is, as Salih repeatedly says, the center of Sudanese civilization. Wat Hamid's geological time preserves the collective unconscious of all its people, real, dreamed, and symbolized. In his interview, Salih says that the political for the writer is the psychical. Accordingly, a scholar, Laura Rice, in her monograph on irony and empire, examines Salih's Sudan, therefore, as a heterotopia, a non-place of language, as unhomely and uncanny. And ultimately, in his aesthetic project, Salih concentrates his artistic world through his use of the first-person pronoun, the lyric I, into what he calls the economy of a poem. In Salih's poetic, political, psychical, material world, the affective defamiliarization aspect has been discussed at length by his critics. So, for example, a very famous post-colonial scholar, Benita Parry, calls Season melancholic, melodramatic, and a novel that, quote, dramatizes the trauma of peripheral modernity, unquote. Parry also describes Salih's overall artistic space as one characterized by, quote, heat-induced delirium of confused thoughts and haphazard memories, quote, unquote. So I'm quoting, bringing these quotes to you to kind of suggest how the affective dimensions of Salih's literary world has been read, perceived. But I'll skip a few of the sections that I have and I'll conclude But and speaking of the palm tree, for example, that Timur was talking about on the cover, it's very suggestive because the palm tree again becomes this really potent symbol for the cognitive, affective, and aesthetic, experimental poetic symbol that I'm talking about in Salih. So the palm tree is of course, very important. I have a couple more. I have actually a lot more, but I'll probably have to skip so much of this. I can talk about some of this in the Q&A, but I'll probably end with my. What do I do? Yeah, I'm trying to think about how I can summarize the rest of my argument. Yeah, I mean, we can end with reading these sections from Salih and end with the palm tree. But I guess I'll just quickly summarize in one line what I was going to argue after this, and we could go back to this in our conversation afterwards. Which is, this kind of liminality for me becomes a method in Salih as well. So it's not just a thematic, but it's also a method. It's a critical method. And Salih talks about criticism as love, as an act of love, which is where again he invokes Sufi, the Sufi sort of philosophy, Sufi principle, mystical principle, and how does it become a method for Salih is what I was going to say in the rest of my presentation, which is something that has been discussed today in the morning as well, which is how Salih was both had a global approach, but he was also very rooted in Sudan. So when he says, for example, if we could just skip to, these are some of the things. Talk about this more during the Q&A, where he says, an interviewer asked him, where are you from, or how many years have you lived in Sudan? And he said he spent 10 years of his life, in the early 10 years of his life, the first 10 years of his life in Sudan. And when he says, I still live there. So that's how he constantly, very firmly asserted his identity. There was at no point did he say, well, I mean, I just spent my childhood there and I went abroad, Richard. He was always Sudanese. He was always there. He was always. He even said, "I'm a religious person. I'm Muslim." And at the same time, he would say, as in my next slide, he was constantly an outsider too. He said, "I have to live outside. I approach a place. I approach Sudan as if I were looking as an outsider from the outside." And I think he combines the two positions. It's a dialectic that he combines. And so this kind of liminality infused with the mystical principle of love becomes a kind of method for Salih as a writer, as a critic, as a thinker. That's what my final proposition would have been. If I could just show you my last, yes, this is the last slide. I love this quote, so I would maybe like to end here with that quote. And I think this quote for me really demonstrates how Salih is working as a dialectical, he's using his own dialectical positioning, or he's dialectically positioning himself, and how he's using that liminality as a method. He says, some writers are more spontaneous. They are immediately influenced by the events, and they write what may be called a recording of the events of their own time. There are other writers whose experience gets into long and complex processes that result in what may be called a dream. I believe I belong to the second group. And he says, I wait until I forget the personal experience, until it transforms itself into my mind, into a dream, to the point where I can't say whether this character is derived from that personality in reality, or that this event is taken from that event in reality. So he has to actively defamiliarize himself in this manner. And this was going to be my kind of argument. Thank you, and I would love to go back.
Thank you very much. I think I quite like the quote about, you mentioned criticism is love. So sometimes criticism feels like tough love as well, but that's another problem. So I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, comments, etc. I don't know, Timur, would you also like to come here? Okay, I'm registering questions.